Have you ever wondered what happens after we die? Is there truly life beyond this physical existence? Many religions and spiritual traditions around the world share a fascinating idea, that our consciousness, or something like it, moves on, begins anew, continues in another form. This concept is often called reincarnation, but what exactly does reincarnation mean? And how does Buddhism, one of the world's oldest and most profound spiritual traditions, explain this mysterious process? Unlike the popular image of reincarnation as a soul jumping from one body to another, Buddhism offers a perspective that challenges many common assumptions. It invites us to look deeper, beyond the surface of things. To question what we really mean by self, by life, by continuity. In this series, we will explore the rich and nuanced Buddhist teachings on what is often called reincarnation but more accurately described in Buddhism as rebirth. We will delve into ancient scriptures, philosophical insights, and timeless stories to uncover how Buddhism understands this cycle of life, death, and new beginnings. Is there an eternal soul? Does something truly transfer from one life to the next? Or is the process something more subtle and profound? These questions are not only academic, they touch the heart of human existence. Understanding rebirth in Buddhism can transform how we live, how we relate to ourselves and others, and ultimately, how we view the possibility of liberation from suffering. So, join me as we begin this journey into the mystery of rebirth, a journey that will challenge your assumptions, awaken your curiosity, and perhaps open a door to a deeper understanding of life itself. Imagine for a moment, who are you, really? What is this you that thinks, feels, and experiences life every day? Is there a permanent, unchanging self inside, a soul, a core identity, that stays the same from moment to moment, from lifetime to lifetime? This question has puzzled philosophers and spiritual seekers for millennia. And Buddhism offers an answer that may surprise you, one so radical, it turns much of how we think about ourselves upside down. This answer is the teaching of Anatta, or no self. In simple terms, Buddhism says, there is no eternal, unchanging self. No fixed I that exists independently, no soul that reincarnates from one life to another. Instead, what we call self is actually a constantly changing flow, a collection of physical sensations, feelings, thoughts, and consciousness that arise and fade in every moment. Like a river, the self is not a fixed thing, but a dynamic process. Why does this matter for rebirth? Because it means the traditional idea of reincarnation, where a soul moves from one body to the next, doesn't fit with Buddhist philosophy. So how does rebirth happen if there is no permanent self? Buddhism explains this through the principle of dependent origination. Every moment conditions the next, like a flame lighting another flame. This chain of cause and effect continues beyond death, driven by our actions, our karma. Think of it like lighting a candle from another candle. The flame continues. But it is not the exact same flame, it's a new one, shaped by the previous one. Similarly, our consciousness is a flowing process, conditioned by past causes, but never fixed. This understanding frees us from clinging to a rigid sense of self, one of the root causes of suffering, according to the Buddha. It also deepens our view of rebirth, not as a soul's journey, but as a continuation of causes and effects in an ongoing cycle. Now that we've uncovered the revolutionary teaching of Anatta, the absence of a permanent self, the next question naturally arises: if there's no eternal soul, then what exactly drives rebirth? What is the force that carries the momentum of life from one existence to the next? The answer lies in a concept central to all Buddhist thought: karma. Karma literally means action, but it's much more than simple deeds. It's the law of moral cause and effect. Every action, every thought, every intention leaves an imprint, shaping the future in profound ways. Imagine planting seeds in a garden. The type of seed you plant will determine the kind of plants that grow. Similarly, our actions plant karmic seeds that ripen into results, sometimes in this life, often in lives to come. But karma is not fate or predestination. It's a dynamic process, intimately tied to our choices. Positive actions, like kindness, generosity, and compassion, sow seeds that lead to happiness and favorable rebirths. Negative actions, such as greed, hatred, and ignorance, create suffering and unfavorable conditions. This karmic momentum is what fuels samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Samsara is not just physical rebirth, it's the ongoing cycle of craving, attachment, and suffering that binds beings to existence. Think of samsara like a wheel constantly turning, powered by karma. Each life is a spoke on this wheel, conditioned by the actions of previous lives. Yet samsara is not eternal or unchangeable. It's a process that can be understood, transcended, and ultimately ended. How? Through insight into the nature of karma and the practice of ethical living and meditation, one can gradually loosen the grip of craving and ignorance, breaking free from samsara's relentless spin. In this way, karma is both the mechanism behind rebirth and the key to liberation. By now, we've seen that Buddhism denies a permanent self and that karma fuels the cycle of rebirth. But how exactly does this Buddhist view differ from other spiritual traditions, especially those that speak of a soul traveling from one life to the next? Take Hinduism, for example. It teaches the existence of an eternal soul, or Atman, that migrates through countless lives. This soul carries with it the essence of who we truly are, unchanging and eternal. Buddhism, however, offers a profoundly different perspective. It rejects the idea of an eternal soul outright. Instead, it presents life as a dynamic process of causes and conditions, constantly changing, never fixed. Imagine a flame passed from one candle to another. Is it the same flame? No. But it's not completely different either. It's a continuation, a link in a chain of transformation. This metaphor beautifully captures the Buddhist view of rebirth. This process is called dependent origination. Everything arises because of something else. Nothing exists independently or permanently, including what we call self. So, rebirth is not about a soul hopping bodies, it's about the continuation of a karmic stream, a flow of causes and effects, conditions and consequences, weaving the fabric of life across time. This view dissolves many common misunderstandings. It shows that what really moves from life to life is not a thing but a process, a complex web of mental and physical phenomena shaped by past actions. Understanding this difference matters deeply. It changes how we view identity, responsibility, and even freedom. If there's no fixed self, then personal growth and transformation become not just possible but inevitable. We are not bound by an unchanging essence, but can cultivate wisdom and compassion that reshape our entire being. So far, we've explored the radical Buddhist teachings of no self and the karmic cycle that drives rebirth. But understanding these ideas intellectually is only the beginning. Buddhism invites us to go deeper, to experience these truths directly through meditation and mindful awareness. Meditation is not just a technique for relaxation. It is a profound path of insight, vipassana, that reveals the true nature of reality beneath the surface illusions. When we sit in meditation, observing the rise and fall of thoughts, feelings, and sensations, we begin to see something remarkable. Nothing remains constant. Everything changes, moment by moment. This constant flux is the very essence of impermanence, anicca. And as we watch these changes, the sense of a fixed, separate I begins to loosen. We see that what we thought was a solid, permanent self is actually a collection of transient phenomena, ever shifting, never stable. This direct experience of anatta, no self, is transformative. It gently erodes the attachments and cravings that bind us to the cycle of suffering and rebirth, samsara. Moreover, meditation cultivates mindfulness, a clear, present awareness that allows us to respond to life with wisdom rather than react with habitual patterns. Philosophically, this means rebirth is not a mysterious, unknowable process. It is intimately connected to our moment-to-moment choices, thoughts, and intentions. By training the mind to see clearly and act skillfully, we influence not just this life but the unfolding of future lives. We plant seeds of liberation rather than bondage. This insight also deepens our understanding of compassion. Recognizing the interconnectedness of all beings within the endless cycle encourages kindness and empathy, for everyone is caught in samsara's wheel. In essence, meditation bridges the gap between doctrine and direct experience. It reveals how the teachings on no-self and rebirth are not just abstract ideas but living realities we can embody. Buddhist teachings are not just dry doctrines written on ancient scrolls, they come alive through stories, parables, and narratives that have inspired generations across centuries. One of the richest sources of insight on rebirth is the Buddha's own collection of past life stories, the Jataka tales. These are narratives about the many lives the Buddha lived before his final awakening, each illustrating a virtue, a lesson, or a karmic consequence. Imagine a prince who gave up his throne to live as a humble monk, or a wise animal who sacrifices itself to save others. These tales don't just entertain, they teach us about the ripple effects of our actions, the unfolding of karma, and the cycle of rebirth. Through these stories, we see how virtues like generosity, patience, and compassion are not abstract ideals but living seeds that shape our journey through many lifetimes. Another powerful teaching comes from the Sutta Pitaka, where the Buddha describes rebirth not as a mystical event but as a natural continuation of mental habits and tendencies. He compares it to a flame passing from one candle to another. No soul travels, but the momentum continues. These teachings emphasize that rebirth is intimately connected to ethical conduct and mental development. They invite us to reflect: what kind of life are we cultivating now? What seeds are we planting for future growth or suffering? These ancient stories and teachings remind us that rebirth is not just a distant, mysterious process but a living reality shaped by our daily choices. As we come to the close of this journey into the mystery of rebirth, it's clear that Buddhism offers not just answers but a transformative vision, one that goes far beyond the simple idea of reincarnation. Rebirth, in the Buddhist view, is not the passing of an unchanging soul from one body to another. Instead, it is a dynamic, flowing process, a continuation of causes, conditions, and karmic momentum that shapes our existence across countless lives. Understanding this shifts how we see ourselves and the world. It invites us to recognize the impermanence of all things, the absence of a permanent self, and the profound responsibility we carry for our actions. But the Buddhist path does not stop there. It points us toward liberation, nirvana, freedom from the endless cycle of birth, suffering, and death. This liberation is not found by clinging to identity or chasing pleasures but by cultivating wisdom, ethical conduct, and compassion. Through mindfulness and insight meditation, we come to see the truth of anatta and anicca, no self and impermanence, in our own experience. This awakening gradually loosens the bonds of craving and ignorance, ending samsara's grip. So, while rebirth may seem mysterious or distant, its teachings guide us to live more fully, more wisely, and with deeper compassion here and now. In embracing these truths, we step onto a path of profound transformation, a path that leads not just to future lives but to freedom in this very moment. Thank you for walking this path with me. May this understanding inspire you, guide you, and bring peace to your journey.